Hi there, and welcome to the Bellingham City Club. My name is Forrest Longman, and I am the current president of the City Club Board of Directors. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. And we begin today by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people, and has been this way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank all our volunteers who make our programs possible. Specifically, I'd like to call out KMRE radio board member Robert Clark, who's producing today's program, and BTV10, who will be broadcasting it to their viewers. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support. They're Bruce and Claudia Dysand, Danny Neal, real estate broker of the Moliat Group, the Firehouse Arts and Events Center, Colshan CPAs, Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, and the Whatcom Community Foundation. Next month's program will focus on the Supreme Court as it now functions, its history, and the erosion of confidence in this court. And now I'll hand things off to today's moderator.
Hi, I'm Amy Nelson. I'm very pleased to moderate this program today on marijuana 10 years after. The sale of cannabis products for medical use was legalized in 1998 in Washington state. Recreational retail sales were legalized in 2012 following voter approval of Initiative 502, and the first retail shops opened in 2014. So what impacts has that had on us? What impacts has it had financially on the state? What are the challenges that retailers face with cannabis still illegal at the federal level? And what medical needs are being met now with cannabis products? And what's the potential for the future? Today, we're delighted to have two outstanding sources to help us answer these questions: Western professor and neuroscience researcher Josh Kaplan and Danielle Rosellison, co-founder of a medical-grade cannabis retail company who's active in state-level policy issues. So on the financial side, Washington state collected more than $559 million in marijuana income and license fees in 2021, 95% more than from liquor. Where does that money go? For the Office of Financial Management, around half goes to help provide basic health care services to working people and other people who lack insurance coverage at a cost that does not create a barrier to using necessary health care services. Another big chunk goes to the general fund, smaller amounts to the Washington State Healthcare Authority, local governments, the State Liquor and Cannabis Board, Department of Health, State Patrol, and about 1.8 million is designated for other uses, including research and education. On the therapeutic side, cannabis products are widely available around our state and are used by prescription or self-prescribed for chronic pain, anxiety, inflammation, and insomnia. With legalization, research has been able to dig more deeply into how cannabis may affect the brain, particularly in youth and children, as well as what other medical applications it may have. With our society's opioid addiction crisis, might cannabis offer a safer solution? There's so many questions. Let's now turn to our experts for answers. Professor Josh Kaplan, who leads the Kaplan Lab at Western Washington University. The group studies developmental consequences and therapeutic efficacy of cannabis. Their goal is to optimize cannabis medicinal benefits, minimize side effects, and better understand its impact on the developing brain. Among the lab's specific research areas of focus recently are the use of cannabis in treating traumatic brain injuries, effects on stress-induced inflammation and pain sensitivity, and its role in producing positive mood and social behavior, in particular in an autism spectrum disorder model. So Josh?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me here and getting the chance to speak. Yeah, our lab has one of the benefits that we have here at Western Washington is we really can take our research in a variety of different directions based on people's individual interests who enter and work in our lab. And so a lot of my background research in the cannabis field really stemmed from understanding the potential anti-epileptic effects that cannabis can have, which ended up kind of leading towards the FDA approval of the first cannabis-based or cannabis-derived drug to treat pediatric epilepsy. And that is now known as Epidiolex, and that is at this point in time the only FDA-approved cannabis-derived therapy for medicinal purposes. But as Amy noted, there are many additional potential therapeutic effects, and our lab are working to explore those here. So thank you for having me, and definitely looking forward to your questions.
Great. Great. And we also have Danielle Rosellison, co-founder of Trailblazing Productions, a majority female-owned company. They're socially responsible cannabis provider of consistent, reliable medical-grade products that offer viable alternatives to pharmaceuticals. She's also a board member of the Cannabis Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to the advancement of a sustainable, ethical, viable cannabis industry. Their inclusive range of membership includes farmers, retailers, labs, and ancillary businesses, as well as patients, consumers, and veterans. So Danielle?
Thanks for having me. I just wanted to do a quick correction. In the very beginning, you mentioned that I'm a retailer. I am not a retailer. In Washington State is one of the only states that does not allow vertical integration. So we had to choose either growing or selling. You couldn't do both. And so we are a producer processor. We are not a retailer. Thank you guys so much for having me. My dad was the first person in our family to go to college. And then due to financial constraints, he took a quarter off, and that was the quarter he got drafted for Vietnam. So if you fast forward about 22 years, 30 years, I was 22 when I figured out that the plants in the basement, that with the lights that I wasn't allowed into, what he was actually doing down there was not growing tomatoes. And then if you fast forward a little bit farther, in 2015, we hired our first group of employees. We hired 15 people. We signed a lease for more money than I'd ever made in my whole entire life. And my dad became one of the 22 veterans who commit suicide every day in this country. And so to me, cannabis is so much more about, recreational use, adult use. It is about medicine first and foremost. That is why we are here today, is because the patients demanded access to something that worked for them, regardless of what the laws and the policies were from a federal level. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's jump into some questions then. We've got one for Danielle first, and that is about the black market. One of the aims of Initiative 502 was to squelch black market sales. What has happened to that in the interim since legalization? And are the pretty hefty level of taxes that we pay in Washington State, something like 46% when excise and sales tax are included, is that pushing customers to the black market, or what's happening with that?
That's such a good question. I'm going to work on vernacular first. In our industry, we have been asked not to call it the black market by many minorities out there. Calling it the black market they consider it a racist term. So we try to use terms like the illicit market, the unregulated market, the legacy market, the traditional market, the original market. Take your pick. So I'll talk about the illicit market. It is 100% still going, both in Washington State and on a federal level. The illicit market is about $1,500 to $2,600 a pound, which is basically we produce high, mid, low, top shelf product, and that's about what we get in a regulated market. And so for us, it is, as growers, and it is incredibly difficult to get rid of an illicit market when you can be an illicit grower and have no packaging and no compliance and no traceability and no nothing. I mean, the money is still there. There's also still a lot of questions in Washington State about knowing your farm, right? The testing is an emerging science still, and so what is required on the labels and how people choose to purchase, people just don't trust the product. You know, I have fought for pesticide regulations. Washington State has amazing pesticide rules around cannabis products. However, until recently, they have had zero enforcement of said rules. And so a lot of people continue to use the traditional market because that is who they know. They get it from their friends and family. They get it from farmers markets. They get it from their own private dealers. It's about 60% of the market still in Washington today. And yes, the taxes do affect that, but it's not the only thing that affects that. If we were to reduce the taxes, you still have 7 shops over by Trader Joe's because of state rules and because of local zoning requirements. And so as long as we have these high concentrations of shops all in one place, you're not going to see a decrease in taxes also affect an increase in sales, because there will still have this competitiveness because they're all required to be right next door to each other. Lots of factors.
Mhm. Wow, that's a big chunk, 60%. And thank you for that correction on the terminology.
You bet.
So Josh, your group's research looks at effects on the developing brain. What have you learned about this? And what does science know about side effects of cannabis in medical applications?
Yeah, a really good question. And I just want to point out, Danielle, every time I hear you speak, I learn something. So I really appreciate your thorough response there. One of the things that has driven us to consider the effects of cannabis on the developing brain, and my lab in particular focuses on specifically cannabidiol, which is one of the many chemicals that is produced by the cannabis plant. It is there's increasing popularity in part because it's easier to access. You can get it at everything from the airport to your local grocery store. And there's this perception that it's safe. But CBD, just like THC and other chemicals produced by the cannabis plant, can affect the developing brain. And they can get into the developing brain through a variety of mechanisms. It can be passed through the placenta, as well as it can be accumulated in the breast milk. So for breastfeeding mothers, they can certainly pass that cannabinoid into the developing brain. And children are now being administered cannabis or cannabis-based medicines to help treat everything from behavioral disturbance. We're seeing an increase in use for treating autism, epilepsy, and other conditions. And the nascency of this medicinal use makes it so that we don't really have a good long-term understanding of the consequences here. And so my lab has tried to identify whether there are unique developmental windows where that exposure is most harmful. And we have looked at a variety of different ones and have found that there are some susceptibility periods that can have long-term persistent consequences, even after the person stops being exposed. And I do think that, if we think about the cost risk benefit, weighing that cost risk benefit here, one of the things that is really striking to me is the range and the variability in how much of these cannabinoids do cross over from the mother into the child. And they've done, for instance, studies where they've looked at the amount of cannabis, specifically THC, that accumulates in the breast milk. And it can range anywhere from 0.4% to 8% of what the mother consumes. That's a big difference. And we don't know what the predictive genetic elements are there that might make someone very likely to pass that on to their child or less likely. And so I think we just need to err on the side of this can be making its way to the developing brain, so we need to understand it. And some of the consequences that we've observed in our research relate to impairments to learning and memory later on. We've seen more kind of risk-taking behavior. And this has been observed in a number of additional kind of developmental studies where they see that early exposure to cannabis can impact the brain's reward circuitry in a way that could increase levels of impulsivity, but also can make it so that people are more likely to engage in high-risk behaviors later on. But it always comes back to this cost benefit analysis, because for many kids and for many people, this might be the most effective or only treatment for their condition. Again, I mentioned earlier that I studied pediatric epilepsy disorder, specifically where children were having hundreds of seizures a week. And they, of course, had tried other traditional medications, the traditional prescription anti-epileptics that were available, and nothing worked. And so cannabis represents this opportunity from a medicinal perspective to kind of think outside the box. By targeting different mechanisms in the brain and body, people are able to, or at least have been reported to, achieve certain health benefits in a way that the currently available medications don't. So we're always trying to figure out what the risk is and whether or not the benefits outweigh those risks.
I have to ask you, because now I'm totally enthralled. It's like risk-taking behavior, causation versus correlation. If you're a mom who consumes cannabis during pregnancy, you probably have more risk-taking behavior. And so how do you decide whether it's causation or correlation?
That's a great question. And, the human data are really messy for that reason. They are the whole chicken or the egg, because we know correlation does not equal causation. And so, you can look at studies on birth weights or other kind of behavioral outcomes of cannabis using mothers during gestation. And honestly, those data are they're all over the board. There's very little consistency across different longitudinal studies, meaning over time. What we do is we take that question and we bring it into a laboratory where we study this in preclinical models, rodent models, where we can very clearly delineate one group who gets exposure, others that do not, and follow that throughout their lifetime. So that gives us a little bit of a sense of the causation, but you're absolutely right that in the human literature, it gets a lot more messy and it's really hard to pin down one particular outcome. Usually these statements that I'm making here relate to kind of a massive amount of data that we can try to summarize and point in one direction or the other, but there's not one clear indicator that guarantees an outcome.
Dude, I could nerd out with you all day long.
Yeah, well, this is great. I love that. So a question for Danielle that steers us into the financial side again. Because of the federal laws decriminalizing cannabis and its sale and use, retailers in Washington typically operate on a cash-only basis. How does that play out for employees and for customers? And why are some dispensaries or retailers able to process bank payments?
My gosh, such good questions. So first of all, Washington is one of the most progressive states with access to banking for cannabis. We actually have 8 different credit unions that allow, because we're so highly regulated in who we've given licenses to, those banks feel comfortable in order to give us bank accounts. Now they're usury rates, right? Like we spend $500 a month for a checking account and then a percentage of all of our cash deposits. Like it's insane, but we do have banking. I don't know any licensed company in Washington state that does not have a bank account. So that's really stinking positive. The bigger problem is, well, a couple of things. Any retailer or anybody who is taking debit cards or credit cards is laundering money. That's not legal, right? So the way that the Visa and MasterCard or debit cards are actually categorizing it is not legal. And so anybody taking those debit or credit cards is opening themselves to a world of hurt. So when you ask why some do it and some don't, they're not educated on how it is not legal what they're doing and could get them in a world of hurt later on. I would say also the biggest issue that we run into is there's this ongoing thing that we have a whole lot of cash and we have a whole lot of cannabis. And so we're running into a lot of theft problems, and some of that is about, lack of policing after this huge policing movement before. There's a lot of things going on. The media does not help us at all because they like to tell everybody how much cash and how much cannabis we have. And so they really perpetuate this problem. But Washington State's done a good job at trying to mediate it as best we can. And we continue to talk to our legislators saying that safe banking is the #1 thing that the cannabis industry needs. I will also point out that the biggest issue that we have is federal tax code 280E. Because we're not legal on a federal level, we are subject to 280E, which means that we are not allowed to write off any business expenses that are not touching the plant. So a retailer, for example, can write off the purchase of our product, and that's it. They have to claim all their expenses on employees, on rent, on everything else as income and pay taxes on that as if it was income. And so that is one of the biggest problems we run into with regards to a lack of safe banking and tax fairness, basically, as a business.
Mhm. What about payroll? How does it work for employees to get paid?
I mean, we all have checking accounts, right?
Yeah.
So we deposit our checks,
Okay.
we deposit our cash, and then we pay them. Now, I will tell you, sometimes we get a lot of cash and sometimes we have to do payroll in cash, right? And my daughter, I have pictures of her at like 4 years old in like princess outfits, fully with like tens of thousands of dollars in front of her, laying out all the money for all the employees. It doesn't happen very often, but I have definitely kept pictures of this because it was a great way to teach my kids about money when they were young.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. It sounds like a music video. Do you see this issue? I mean, this whole like safe banking, it almost feels like this is an actual opportunity for bipartisan agreement. Am I wrong?
It's a bipartisan issue, right?
Yeah.
Everybody, but the problem is that out of the top 10 issues for every federal legislature, we're number 11. Which I've never understood. We touch on healthcare, we touch on veterans, we touch on everything you can, sustainability, we touch on all of it. And for some reason, and we know what the reason is, it's because of prohibition, right? It's because for years it has been illegal. And so there's the stigma that continues to be attached to it. But everybody, well, not everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike are helpful with some of our issues. It's just not the most important things to them.
So I'm assuming there's no current legislation pending that would address any of
There's
this.
always legislation pending, but have you seen how hard it is to get something through the House and the Senate lately?
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, it's issue number 11, right?
Yeah.
It's just not on that top 10 that people are willing to ride or die for because they're worried about the stigma attached with them trying to pass something with cannabis, even though cannabis approval ratings on a national level are a super majority. They are over 67%. So it's a classic case of getting our government to catch up with the needs and wants of the people.
Yeah. 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 So Josh, you mentioned some of the treatments that cannabis is used for now. Are there some that jump out as more promising in the near term?
There are quite a few, and I'm excited about several of them that have kind of gone through early clinical trials and others that are kind of building up the evidence here. The one that is, like I mentioned, currently approved for really is in certain forms of treatment-resistant epilepsies, where people have tried traditional anti-epileptic medications, they don't work, they try this, it seems to be helpful. But there are a number of additional conditions that people are considering this for and have found benefit, both from anecdotal as well as to certain clinical trials. And it ranges across quite a spectrum depending on what type of cannabis people are using. And I say type very loosely here, but again, the cannabis plant has immense diversity. Danielle could speak more to this different strain variations within Washington and how they produce different chemicals. But it ranges from plants that are very rich in THC, the kind of intoxicating, high-inducing cannabinoid, all the way to very low levels of THC, but rich in the cannabinoid cannabidiol, which does not have intoxicating effects, but is thought to still convey many of the therapeutic effects of the plant. And so depending on what type of plant you're looking at, it could have different effects. And there's been just a lot of recent interest in the pain relieving effects that cannabis can have. We are really interested in our lab, and not just pain in general, but specific types of pain, like trauma-induced pain, where people who have gone through trauma or stressful periods in their life kind of have this enhanced inflammatory response in their brain and body. And we are very interested in looking at how cannabis can be a treatment for that. We also just published a paper looking at or investigating the potential for the neuroprotective effects, that is kind of like the brain protective effects that cannabis can have following traumatic brain injury. This speaks to some of the upcoming clinical trials that are going to be conducted in patients with PTSD following traumatic brain injury, as well as clinical trials that are being supported by professional sports leagues like the National Football League, as well as the National Hockey League, which are putting a lot of money now into considering their veteran athletes and looking at potentially using cannabis in some sort of integrative manner to help with some of the kind of the secondary symptoms of their multiple head injuries or concussions they sustain during sport. So I'm very excited about the direction that might have from a protective standpoint. If you think about kind of just like why people use the cannabis medicinally, and I'm sure Danielle has a lot of great information on this too, because she's on the front lines here. But a lot of people report using it just to help with sleep, help reduce stress, help with anxiety, and using the right product at the right dose is really important for achieving those benefits. And so that's definitely a larger conversation to be had about how to use properly. But I think there's just a wide-ranging spectrum of benefits, again, ranging from pain to neuroprotection to anxiety and sleep, that comes back to how people use it and what they're using as far as achieving the best therapeutic effects.
Well, and I'll just tag team on that a little bit. People think, oh, I'm using cannabis to help me sleep. Well, is it high in CBN? Because it's the CBN that is going to help you the most with the sleep, not just any kind of cannabis out there. So knowing what the cannabinoids you're looking for, knowing your own personal body and the terpene effects and whatnot, this is going to help make sure that you can really key in the effects that you're looking for. I'm sure most of you guys, like me, when we were in school as young kids, we learned about the nervous system, we learned about the respiratory system, we learned about all these systems that we have in our bodies. They never touched on the fact that we all have endocannabinoid systems. And just like the name suggests, the key to the endocannabinoid system, which is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but the key to the endocannabinoid system, the purpose of the endocannabinoid system is basically to create homeostasis in your body, is to keep it as regulated and balanced as it possibly can. And the key to an endocannabinoid system apparently seems to be cannabinoids, which is going to be found in your cannabis plants.
Yeah, and well, one of the reasons you probably didn't learn about it early on is because it's a relatively newly discovered system in the body. I mean, we didn't really know how cannabis was working to induce the effects it was having until as late as 1990. At that point, it was just speculated that we had these receptors in our brain and body that mediated THC and cannabis's effects. And it really then, about momentum. It takes time. It takes decades before that starts getting integrated into medical textbooks and so on. So this is kind of considering the larger kind of brain and neurotransmitter systems as a whole. This is a new one, and we're just learning the true extent of its importance. I would add, though, Danielle, that in addition to the effects on the endocannabinoid system, which certainly mediate many of the effects, I think the therapeutic excitement out there, at least for me, is beyond the endocannabinoid system. We think about CBD, for instance. CBD has over 65 known targets in the brain and body. So it's far more than just endocannabinoids. And that's what excites me. And that's where I think when you're considering conditions that otherwise don't respond to the traditional medications, now these cannabinoids allow us to kind of investigate novel targets that maybe weren't considered for this condition, and they can hit multiple things at once. And that's where I think why you start seeing benefits of cannabis-based medicines in treating things like depression, certain types of neuropathic pain, epilepsy, where other medications have failed that often just target one thing. Here you're hitting something that targets multiple systems. And that to me is where the excitement lies, in addition to the cannabinoid system itself.
Do you see a difference in like things that like cannabis products that are isolates versus whole plant medicine? Do you see a difference in what helps more consistently?
We are actively trying to ask that question. So we work with isolates, we work with full plant extracts, and we can do systematic additions to things. And what we have observed in our lab is that the addition of certain like aromatic terpenes, the things that give cannabis its unique odors and flavors, to the cannabinoid themselves increases the therapeutic effects. It doesn't seem to, in our hands, make it more effective from like if we're going to reduce pain from a 10 to a 5, we don't see that it changes the magnitude of the effect, but it makes it so that a wider range of doses is equally as effective. And I think if you're considering effective use, you got to expand the range in which it's working for people. So
that's so cool.
Yeah. It sounds like there is a lot of multidisciplinary research going on in the medical community. So that is there a marijuana journal, a cannabis journal?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Fascinating.
And there are more and more and special issues of other journals that are devoted to these topics. And
yeah. So lots of information out there already. Yeah.
yes, in part because of the immense complexity of this plant. Danielle mentioned another cannabinoid, CBN, and there are hundreds of others too that people are just starting to investigate. And one of the limitations that researchers have faced is just the legal access to bringing this stuff into the lab and bringing it into the lab at a reasonable cost. I mean, when I first started at Western Washington, I purchased 1 gram of cannabidiol. Now, if you go to, the co-op downtown and you could see how much 1 gram would cost, even in a commercial product, it cost us $2,000 for 1 gram of CBD. That is a ridiculously large amount that had we continued along that path, all of our funding would have dried up. Fortunately, there are now ways that we can get cannabinoids in a much cheaper way, but that was one of the limitations we were facing was cost, Schedule 1 licensing from the DEA, and Danielle as a potential provider saw a lot of those challenges as well.
Yeah, we looked at getting FDA approved to be a grower. And just like you said, like you couldn't have a state licensed business active at the same time that you were going to produce an FDA federally licensed business. So we would have to shut down our company and supplying to everybody, which is basically what funds it, and only provide to FDA researchers, which means all of a sudden you're looking at $2,000 grams instead of $5 grams.
Yeah. Wow.
Gotta love the government.
Challenges everywhere. So on the question of insurance, how it works for somebody who is wanting to get some relief or whatever with their product. Danielle, how does insurance pay for any of these treatments, or and if so, how does that work? What's the process?
It's complicated. Well, let's just start there. Nothing about this is easy. There are FDA approved, basically isolates medications, but they have not been necessarily seen as effective as what people will find for whole plant. And they're usually much more expensive or have side effects or whatnot. And so if you're looking at, cannabis from the state store, it's a whole different ballgame. The Ames Institute in Seattle is a super cool company that has doctors on staff. They have to be real careful about how they do this, but they accept, cannabis medicine, psilocybin medicine, all these different types of treatments that they believe work well for people. And so insurance will cover your initial medical evaluation. Insurance will cover your mental evaluation. Insurance will not, they will say in general, you may want to consider going and finding something that's high in CBN, and you may want to consider going to one of these stores to purchase it because they have intelligent bud tenders that know what they're looking for. And then you can come back in here. They cannot administer the product, but they can have like a They can consume it and use like psychotherapy while they're there. Insurance will not cover that. They won't cover the cost of the product nor the visit then, but then insurance can cover the post-op after that. So the most difficult thing, just like it's important to know your farmer, it's important to know your doctor. There are a lot of whack jobs out there that are just on the bandwagon, right? And so making sure that you know that this doctor is accredited and has a lot of information on this and is not just, you know, kind of just on the bandwagon is important. But overall, you're not going to see any kind of relief for cannabis products from an insurance company. Now, I can tell you that we have been actively working for the last 6 years to get medical grade cannabis. It's DOH compliant. It's got this really ugly logo on it that this doesn't tell you anything, but the magic of that means that it's medical cannabis. We are trying to get those products in retail shops if you have a medical authorization to not have 37% excise tax. We have gotten it through the House and the Senate multiple times. It's just issue number 11. We can never quite get it over the finish line. So we're hopeful this year that Washington State will pass that. They had a hearing on it yesterday, and we'll at least be able to give those patients that are registered with the state to not have to pay that 37% excise tax.
Do you happen to know the bill number
Yes.
for our
Give me a
political
second. I'll get back to you.
activists?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great to know. So, Josh, you talked a little bit about this previously, but in terms of recommendations to the medical community, it sounds like you might have if you were to make one recommendation for let's do this next, what would that be?
Can I make two?
Yes, you may.
I would say the first one would be identifying what the patient is taking. If they come to you and say, I use cannabis, what are they taking? And advising against super high potency THC products. I don't see a medicinal benefit in that. If anything, it will make it worse in the long term, in part because of the way that THC acts on this endocannabinoid system that Danielle brought up. And one of the problems with overactivating it is that it goes away. The body has ways of saying, you know what, this is too active, let's rein it in. And that can make the symptoms that using cannabis in the first place for worse over time. So my first recommendation would be focus on lower potency products. The second would be consider the potential drug-drug interactions that cannabis use can have from so safety perspective here. CBD, as well as some of the other cannabinoids, can affect the liver enzymes that we use to break down other drugs or medicines that we might be consuming. And so that could in turn lead to elevated levels of certain other drugs that make it kind of fall outside of the therapeutic dose range that is needed. There are actually really good resources for this. Penn State created this app that basically asks you, what are you taking? What type of cannabis are you using? What other medications? And is there an actual interaction here? Is this safe or not? So if there was an intervention to the medical community, I'd say check that app for your patients to make sure that there's not going to be a potential drug-drug interaction, and tell them to calm it down on the level of THC, because I think the escalation in the THC potencies and in your kind of standard recreational strain is more of a result of the recreational market driving this as opposed to a medicinal need.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because there may be patients who aren't apt to divulge their use, and that could create some issues. So
interestingly, there aren't, and there have been a number of studies looking at the just overall safety and tolerability of, they've done this at a variety of different ages, but elderly patients who are often on additional medications and are also using medicinal cannabis. And there doesn't seem to be any real contraindications there. There don't seem to be many adverse effects from the addition of medicinal cannabis. But from a theoretical standpoint, this is a concern, and one that when I consult or talk to physicians in the community, I share this information that there are potential drug-drug interactions, but there are also resources to check those.
Yeah, great.
I'm going to just throw in here, there has been a bill to reduce high potency cannabis products for a couple of years now, and UW is on a warpath to get this thing through. Personally, I am not pro high potency products. It's not something that we engage in. That is me personally. That said, the purpose of having a legal regulated market is testing and safe products. And if you remove the ability to get high potency products from a regulated market, they will get them from an unregulated market. They won't go away, right? It's not like they're going to stop dabbing. They're just going to get them unsafe, untested, untaxed from somebody else. And so there's got to be, like with everything, education. Does anybody think it's a good idea for 21-year-olds to be dabbing multiple times a day? No. Does most 21-year-olds care? No. And so how do we help this age group and this demographic care more about what they're putting in their bodies? And I have zero answers to that question, because I was one of them. I didn't care. And a lot of our consumption usage, if you look at the reports, consumption type and potency is directly correlated to lifestyle. Do you have children, right? And a lot of those people that are consuming high potency products are also working full-time jobs and totally stressed out. The number one reason people are using cannabis is for relaxation, decrease in stress, right? And so we're back to a bigger societal problem of why are our young adults, our 21 to 25-year-olds so stressed out and thinking that they need to go to high potency cannabis in order to decrease that stress.
Yeah, it's an important question.
Education.
Can I jump in here with
Of
a
course.
question from the chat? It kind of related, because it's talking about people who really, they're unschooled in the medical use at all, and they hear that it helps with sleep or with some kind of chronic pain that they have. So where do they go if their doctor isn't receptive? I'm concerned, and I think this person is too, about who you talk to in these various shops that sell it. How good are they at being able to diagnose the problem and say, this is what you should use?
I'm going to get myself in a lot of trouble over this one. So I will stick to facts. The average bud tender in Washington State keeps that job for 3 months. Okay. So, and I will also point out that the retailers in Washington State were given basically a golden ticket. You put $250 into a hat. If they drew out your name, you might have been one of the 300 stores that got chosen. So we do have retailers that may know nothing about cannabis. They may know nothing about business. They may know nothing about either. And yet they hold the key to all products coming into their, getting access to the consumers. So how do you find out what kind of products are best for you? It is about research. It is about finding a Ames Institute I mentioned before. If you Google cannabis doctors, cannabis nurses, there's lots of information out there. I have a bazillion networking and references if you want people to talk to. But I would never, there are great bud tenders out there. They are few and far between.
Danielle, was there ever a medical certificate or something like that for bud tenders? Did that ever pan out? I remember hearing about that.
There is definitely, I can talk of it. Yes, there is a medical certification, and it is pretty useless, right? It's basically talking about all the things that bud tenders cannot say from a liability standpoint, not about educating bud tenders about products and what might be helpful for people. So the bud tenders that are fantastic are people that have gone out on their own and have done a ton of research and are continuing education. I mean, bud tenders is a minimum wage job, right? Like it is, and it is retail, right? It is ultimately retail, which they find out is not nearly as much fun as they had hoped it would be, right? And so there's no easy answer to this except more education through perseverance. I will point out the Cannabis Alliance has a ton of members and that they are people that I would go to network with because they're people that share similar values that I think are important. They're not out there just to make money for the most part. They are not out there just to make money. They are out there because they believe in the plant and they believe in the uses and they have lots of information around those. And the
Yeah.
Ames Institute in Seattle is fantastic if you need a medical professional to help you with what kind of products you need. And then, like I said earlier, they figured out the insurance caveats.
Mhm. Oh, that's great information. Jane, did you want to pull another question out of the chat?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's kind of, I guess, related to what we've been talking about guidelines for dosages. So you've got some arthritis, you want to get something to feel better. How would you choose? I mean, Danielle, you mentioned these resources, but is there a path that, I mean, we're also used to Googling something and getting an answer or a path that takes us somewhere, but how really do people make those decisions?
I mean, they make them by what bud tenders tell you. And bud tenders are not a very good source of information.
Okay.
90% of the time. If you have arthritis, I'd be looking at lotions, right? But then there's going to be difference between whole plant lotions versus isolate lotions. Like there's there's lack of consistency oftentimes. Sometimes it's produced from hemp, sometimes it's not. There's a lot of different pieces to that. And so it's basically trial and error. And when you find one that works, stick to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think one of the greatest challenges that faces the medicinal cannabis industry from an efficacy standpoint is dosing. It is not like other drugs where you just take more if you're not getting the benefit. Sometimes you can overshoot that effect. We see that every day in our lab, that too little, not good, too much, also not good. We call this like the Goldilocks zone, where you kind of have to be within this window to achieve the benefits that one is seeking. And the larger challenge is that different conditions, different reasons for using have different Goldilocks zones. And one of our lab's missions, if you will, is to try to expand that, to make it easier to get the benefits, but also to expand it across different conditions, because sometimes people are taking it because they are stressed and have pain, but they have different Goldilocks zones. So how do you find that? And I think Danielle mentioned it. You kind of, maybe you start low and you escalate, you build up. One of the things too, though, about using is that if you use it regularly, the amount in your body builds up over time. It's not like you take it, goes away, but it can build up. And so again, starting with small amounts and slowly building up, I think is the best way. Unfortunately, at this point, it's kind of trial and error. And it can be an expensive pursuit as well. And I wish I could say that the clinical trials have revealed optimal doses. It just hasn't. It hasn't. And we are still in that infancy of identifying how to best use it.
Well, and most people are getting their information from bud tenders, right? Which I totally understand. The issue that I constantly run into with bud tenders is that they have incredibly high tolerance. They consume all the time. So when somebody like me comes in there and I have low tolerance and I'm like, hey, I just want something that's just gonna, take the edge off. A bud tender might suggest something that is like 20% THC, because to them, that's really low. Guys, my favorite cannabis is 4% THC and 8% CBD, right? Like it is like, and that wouldn't even begin to touch most bud tenders. And so that's where some of this communication breaks down as well, as from what's good for them may not be the same that is good for the other people out there in different tolerance levels.
4% THC, Danielle, that's like the high level back in 1990.
Totally.
Like, now we have gone so far and beyond. So when people say that used to work for me, or I used to use this amount in the 80s, like it was a different animal back then. And
well, back then we didn't know what the percentage was. There was no testing on these things.
Well, it was lower.
Or was there?
I've seen graphs that show that the average amount of government held THC levels in these plants were much lower. But
Well, the government held THC levels are still much lower, aren't they?
yeah, well, the government produced ones, yes.
Right.
But the seized ones from marijuana busts were much lower than they currently are.
Mhm.
Well, the other thing that we see is because the state regulations have required us to put THC and CBD on the labels. That is what people are basing how high it will make them. But anybody who's in this industry knows that that's not an accurate statement, right? That is not necessary. Higher THC does not necessarily make you higher, and it depends on your own personal body type. You know, for people that want to reduce anxiety, we have a Cinex that's like 14% THC, and everyone that we talk to is like, that is a game changer. It totally helps me take away that stress. We cannot get a retailer to put it in their stores because 14% is so low, they can't get anybody to buy it because consumers have been taught that higher THC will make them higher, which then is perpetuated in retailers' buying practices, and then becomes perpetuated in labs trying to get higher THC so that you can then sell it to retail. It is a mess, guys. Tangent, sorry.
Well, here's a question from the chat. And they want to know, and it kind of relates to this in a way, is this a gateway drug then that go higher and higher and then maybe to try something else because that didn't work? I think that's one of the reasons that the people who are opposed to legalization have to say about it. So what is your opinion?
Can I jump on this one? I have small children. My kids were 1 and 4 when we started this industry. We talked, so they're whatever, 13 and 10 now. Do you know what the gateway drug is, guys? Our children all want it. It changes their brain chemistry. They are always asking for more, and it is processed sugar. That is the gateway drug into addiction and more and more and more, and yet we're never talking about that. So when people ask if cannabis is the gateway drug, I don't think that is their introduction to, you know, addiction, basically. Now, I will say that I have always been concerned that there's a demographic of our children that, you know, nobody thinks that kids should be doing drugs that have not been prescribed by a doctor, right? But kids will rebel, right? Whether at whatever age that happens to be, it is a normal process of human evolution. And so are they going to do something that their parents don't want them to be doing? And if we make cannabis legal, does that mean they're going to try something harder? I've always had that concern. And, you know, I think that is a valid concern, but I also believe that the gateway drug starts with sugar as a young child.
Yeah, the whole gateway drug argument is really interesting from a historical perspective. You know, when they initially made cannabis illegal, that was spearheaded by the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics at the time, Harry Anslinger. And when asked if cannabis was a gateway drug in the initial hearings in front of Congress, he said no. It wasn't until decades later that he changed that stance, but it wasn't based on evidence. And there's still no evidence in humans for that. The reason, in my opinion, why that argument still perpetuates to some degree in the academic circles is because of the effect that cannabis can have, again, on the brain's reward circuitry. It seems to, at least in high amounts of early life exposure, increase the sensitivity to other drugs, which could make somebody escalate to harder drugs, if you will. But study after study I have come across, there's no evidence for that in people. And I think that most recently, in thinking about the opioid epidemic, there's no evidence that states that legalize cannabis lead to more opioid use, which would be predicted if this was a gateway drug. No evidence. If anything, it leads to less. That's also debated, but it certainly doesn't increase. And that is as consistent of a finding as I've seen in the cannabis space. So I do not believe that it's a gateway drug for that reason.
That was way more scientific than my emotional opinion.
But I'm with you on the sugar. I see it too.
So Josh, one question about purity of materials. How you mentioned the $2,000 versus $5 price for some of your materials. How do you determine the purity or the quality of the product that you're using in the lab?
Yeah, so after we went through this fiasco of getting just a single gram of CBD and the challenges and financial burden that created, I actually wrote a letter to the Department of Justice and basically said we should be able to study commercially available products in our laboratory. So we were given access to commercial products that were hemp derived. Now, hemp is just one end of the cannabis spectrum in which the plant produces less than 0.3% THC. So it's rich in CBD. And so we have tested a number of different hemp derived cannabis products that are rich in CBD. And we actually in-house test to see whether or not the amount that is claimed on the label is in the product. We've never found it to be exactly correct. And we've found quite a range, and we've stuck with the products for testing that are at the higher end of what they claim to be the range. So we do test it because we have to know what's in the product that we're looking at. But we also have collaborators in different aspects of the industry that can help provide us with CBD isolate, and we test and confirm that that's what's in it. So that's been really helpful as well, because we are interested in what people are using, so what is out there in the commercial space, but also we are very interested in the individual components and how each one of those components, alone or together, influences the experience. And so we tackle it from both angles.
Yeah.
I just want to throw out, like you said, the difference between hemp and marijuana is a legal definition. It's all the same plant. It's just legally one has less THC in it than the other.
So Danielle, on the people side, what do we know about buyer demographics? Who do we know? Who's shopping in the stores? Or
As I mentioned earlier, millennials are going to be your biggest demographic. They have been here where cannabis has basically been legal their whole lives. They're in that 23 to 40-year-old range, so they consume more before having kids and have more disposable income. Most Gen Xers and baby boomers have a guy. They can still get their products from the same person they've been getting it from since the 1980s, or 60s, depending on how old they are. So millennials are going to be the main demographics that are purchasing.
Okay, that's interesting. So let's see if we jump down here. Oh, and also, Danielle, I guess the tag on to that is that last year there was a dip in sales, but there had been growth every year since then. So
it's crazy. That dip directly correlated to people not getting $600 a week while being unemployed. Isn't that crazy? It turns out when you give people a bunch of free money to not have a job, the cannabis consumption goes up. And when you stop giving them that money, they stop spending so much money on cannabis.
Yeah. Or trim back purchases. I think one of the data points was that people were just spending less per purchase.
Yeah, so if you're making less money, if food and inflation has happened, it's not that they're buying less cannabis, they're just buying cheaper cannabis. Just like when they were getting $600 a week, they were buying more top shelf product than they were bottom shelf product. Cannabis is recession proof. People will always buy, they're going to buy food, they're going to buy alcohol, they're going to buy weed, they're going to buy makeup. They want to feel good. Chocolate, that's the other one, I think.
Yeah, chocolate. Yeah. So, the tests for impairment, I know we don't have legal experts in either of you, but what do you know about the, is there a roadside test, blood test? What happens when law enforcement steps in and says, I'm going to prove that you're impaired?
Do you want to do this, Josh, or do you want me to start?
Why don't you start? I have some thoughts, but take it away.
Well, 5 nanograms is the limit that they say is impairment. Now, that is a random, pulled out of the air number. The short version is that it's really easy to fight that in court because they have to prove that you're impaired, not what is in your bloodstream. For somebody like me, I could be under the impairment level at all times under 5 nanograms, and I am in zero condition to drive. I have seen veterans who have ridiculous amounts of nanograms in their system who are totally okay to drive because our consumption levels are different, right? We were part of a pilot program to help something called the Druid app. And so we worked with the Highway Patrol from Houston and from Wazoo and whatnot. And basically what they did is they've created this app that assesses impairment. And so it doesn't tell you what you're impaired on. You could be impaired because your mom just died, right? Or you could be impaired because you're a concoction of drugs. And so that has been the best identifier of people who are and are not impaired. And I think it's really helpful for, businesses as well, because if you get in a forklift accident, you could still have cannabis in your system, but it might not be over the impairment level, right? And so that is a really good option out there. It's a free app, might be $1 these days for businesses that are looking for that. It is not utilized widely by law enforcement yet. So at this point in time, they're just still doing field sobriety tests. But when we did that green lab with Wazoo and the Houston Highway Patrol, the veteran that I was with passed every single sobriety test, no problem. And he looked at me, he goes, under no circumstances would I have driven the first 2 tests I took. Right.
Wow.
So it just tells you that you can't just look at somebody and assess whether they are impaired or not.
Yeah, and the challenge there is the fact that unlike alcohol, which you consume and it distributes equally throughout the brain and body, cannabis and the cannabinoids specifically are what we call lipophilic, meaning they distribute differently than alcohol does. And so the amount of cannabis, THC in particular here, when we're thinking about intoxication, has in the blood does not give you an indication of what's in the brain. And it's what's in the brain that matters. So the blood test, as Danielle mentioned, it's meaningless unless it comes within some sort of impairment metric. And there's not a great correlation here at this point. One of I think the best kind of future metrics for impairment is going to not be a blood test, but is instead going to be more functional. And they're looking at different types of quickly accessible behaviors that would reflect some sort of intoxication, whether it's from alcohol or from cannabis. And one of those is like an eye tracking system. So they can do this really rapid eye tracking test, which because of where the endocannabinoid receptors are in the brain, it would impact the performance on this test. So that can kind of give you a metric of how much might be in the brain to affect this behavior, because you can have hundreds of nanograms in the blood. If there's nothing in the brain, it doesn't matter.
So Jane, did you want to jump in at this point?
Things I was interested in, and I think you kind of answered it, but I missed it as it went through, was where you and the lab get your source materials. I mean, do you buy them from a wholesale dealer or what?
Sometimes we just go online and we say, what's a popular, we do a lot of vaporization studies in the lab. So we buy vape products that are commercially available that you can buy down the street. But when we're getting our isolates, we do work with companies. We have a collaboration with a company called Abstracts. They make cannabis inspired terpene blends, but they also test stuff with like CBD and other cannabinoids, and they gift us those so that we can study them in the lab. Now, if that CBD was derived from a cannabis plant that produced more than 0.3% THC, it would be illegal for us to have that. But if it's derived from the hemp plant that produces less than 0.3% THC, again, just on the other end of that spectrum, then it's legal. It seems kind of odd, but that's generally our source.
Okay, and define what that word was again, terpene.
Terpene. Yeah, terpenes. So if you ever kind of walk around and you smell cannabis, right? It's not the THC or CBD you're smelling. It's this set of chemicals that the plant also produces, which we just kind of colloquially call terpenes.
Okay.
They're not exclusive to cannabis. many plants, many aromatic plants and flowers produce them. It's just that cannabis produces them in unique compositions that give it a unique odor. So many cannabis plants produce terpenes like linalool, which is what gives lavender its unique pleasant odor. They produce limonene, which is found in citrus plants, beta-caryophyllene, which comes from hops and lemongrass, and pinene, a whole bunch of these other ones, which again, they can affect the user experience, but now they're really believed to also impact the medicinal properties as well as the potential just other kind of aesthetic characteristics. And there was this really interesting study that came out at the end of last year, which basically said it wasn't the THC level that influenced how much you liked the product. It was the terpene composition. And I think Danielle, I see her nodding her head. I think that fits very well with what you stated earlier, that 14%, that's what's for you. It's not a high level of THC, but there's something else about that plant. And it probably stems to the terpenes, because plants that have the same amount of THC and CBD can have very different effects in the same user. And that comes down to those terpenes.
How do you know what is the, if it's the same plant you're getting? I mean, is it like growing beets and you're growing certain kind of beets? And so that has that terpene in it? Or, I mean, it would be different, wouldn't it?
I'll leave that to Danielle. She's the grower here.
Okay.
Well, I was going to kind of go back to what you were saying about terpenes. I don't know if any of you gals and gentlemen ever used to go to the chrysalis when they'd let you smell all the different things, and then they'd say, which one do you want? Do you want lavender? Do you want eucalyptus? And we all kind of like tend to whatever one is our favorite. That's because the terpenes from that botanical plant are the ones that work the best with our systems. Right. And so that's why we like them. And it's the same thing with cannabis, is that different strains are going to produce different terpenes in a majority sense. Now, to answer your question, Jane, it is not that simple. So the terpenes are going to be dependent on every single harvest. And it's going to depend on when you harvest it, how soon, how late. In an ideal world, we could create environments where every single time it was exactly the same every single 52 days. Unfortunately, even with controlled environments, it is very difficult to create that kind of consistency when you're growing a live plant. So for the most part, you're going to see, if you have a consistent grower with consistent strains, you're going to see the same terpenes in excess, but it's not always going to be the case. So sorry.
It makes it sound very unscientific.
Or it's life, right? Like you can't just create the same thing every single time in nature. It just doesn't work that way.
And that's why I think it's so important that we find strategies for expanding this dose window, the therapeutic window, because there is a lack of consistency across products for the reasons Danielle just described. So how can we make it so that if I get the product from Danielle today, I'm going to have the same effects in a year from a different crop, from a different part of the...
You can't. I mean, at this point in time, we can change strain names. The amount of growers that change strain names to the top 10 most popular strains is astronomical, because that's what sells. And because this industry is so difficult to make it in, the government's making a lot of money. That's about it, guys. It is really difficult to create that kind of consistency and know as a consumer what you're getting. At Trailblazing, we don't buy anything from anybody else. We have kept our own plants. We bring no genetics in. It is the same stuff every single time. But we might be one of 10 farms that do that. And we do it because we think consistency is important. It is not the money-making strategy thus far, though.
So you have a consistent product, and do you sell it to only certain people then?
So in Washington State, producer processors, growers are only allowed to sell to retailers. Okay? So that is, they hold the keys. You know, one of my biggest, right now you can find our products at South Bellingham Buds, 2020s, and Smoking Crow. But for a long time, we couldn't get into any stores in Whatcom County. And there was like, what we valued as a company was just very different than from what buyers were buying. And I don't know how else to say that. again, it kind of comes down to the way that the system has been set up. And buyers at retail stores are usually the longest standing bud tender. So somebody who's been there more than 3 months, which does not necessarily make a good buyer. And if that, we're in a unique industry where a lot of people are high that work in this industry. And so trying to find some level of consistency and business professionalism is like the bane of my existence, quite honestly.
Wow.
And I don't know how to get buyers to consistently buy. Here, let me just put this. When they make a movie about this, there will be a montage of the stupid stuff that retailers have said to us. And I'm not bashing retailers. This has just been some of our experience. We once had a retailer tell us they were selling, I'm going to make up a number, $5,000 worth of our product every single week. And one day they didn't want to keep that product anymore because they wanted to pick this other product over here. They were literally stop buying our most popular product to pick up our least popular product. And when we asked them why they were doing this, they told us that 9-Pound Hammer, the name of the popular product, was alphabetized on their menu. So it was always first, and they needed to just shake up their menus. Like that was the logic they were using. And I was like, well, what about your consumers? Maybe they want the same stuff that's been worked. That was not part of their buying strategies. And so it is really difficult from our point of view to get consistent product to our consumers when the bud tenders change as often as they do, when buyers change as often they do, and with the current setup of the market in Washington State. Good luck.
So are you looking for more regulation?
No, I am not looking for more regulation.
Didn't think so.
I mean, I've spent a lot of time.
How are you gonna address this problem?
I mean, I've spent the last 10 years in Olympia trying to address this problem. And it is, I don't know. I don't think, let's just have an offline conversation. We continue to try and educate our government. But there is a lot of misinformation out there. And the bottom line is it's going to take decades to get this to work out well. And in the meantime, what we're going to see is we're going to see mass consolidation, so that you're going to have 2 or 3 companies that win over everything that has nothing to do with what's best for the consumers. And everybody who fought for medicine for patients and for legalizing cannabis, and farmers, small mom and pop farmers who put their everything into this, will lose everything. And that is the future of cannabis in the United States and Washington specifically.
Are there any lessons that are coming out of some of the states that have more fully verticalized systems, like Florida or others, that we could be like,
they're
hey,
all
this works?
so different, right? So Washington State, we really encourage small growers, anybody to get into this. It was a $250 application fee. That's it, right? And so we encourage small growers and try to take away that, create an equitable system for people to get into. Florida, I think, has 6 growers, right? And it has a $250,000 application fee, and you have to have $1 million in the bank, and they only do isolates, right? Mostly flavored isolates. And so like Washington State really tried to do it right. And you have to realize, like, when we did it, Colorado and Washington were the first ones to legalize, and we basically did it completely opposite. And there are lessons to be learned from each way. Ultimately, the money will talk, right? They're not going to create systems that work the best. They're going to create systems so that the people with the most money want to create. And that's just the harsh reality of capitalism in America.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother subject. I'm back to you, Amy.
Well, I think we've covered so much more than the questions that we had prepared. And I really appreciate the dialogue between you two. It's fascinating stuff. You're both, Danielle, you're truly a pioneer in the industry, and just a huge source of knowledge. And Josh, your information about the medical side, the dosage, the various uses is really inspiring. I don't know if either one of you has something occurred to you that you wanted to add. We've had some excellent information. Really appreciate your participating. But if you've got more thoughts, let's have them.
I don't have any additional thoughts. I mean, this has been a lot of fun. I'm just so excited by the field itself and the direction it's going from a medicinal and therapeutic standpoint. I think that the more it's out there, the more it's available, the stigma around it is shifting. And I think it's shifting in positive ways. And again, we're seeing this all the way up into professional leagues that are starting to adopt it and at least starting to investigate its potential utility, because we have a lot of health problems in our society that we need to start looking outside the traditional box that we have currently. And I'm excited about the money that is being invested, the efforts among researchers, not just in the United States, but really this is a global research effort. And so I think the most exciting times are yet to come.
I got nothing, guys. You know, if you're interested in getting in the industry, call me first. I can probably talk you out of it in 3 minutes or less. If you are a consumer, know your farm. You know, please don't buy the most shiny things out there. Please look at, ask your local retailer, who is local to Whatcom County. Whatcom County has 110 growers. We have the most growers per capita. Local growers could really use local support from the consumers.
Yeah. Well, thank you also for that link to the Ames Institute. Sounds like a great source.
Yeah, they're great. One of the lead doctors there is like the head of Bastyr. They're amazing people all around, and they will give you this untraditional advice that is medically based. And I respect their opinions on basically all things. So enjoy.
Fantastic.
I have one more question in the chat, in the Q&A, and it's quite interesting. It's an anonymous attendee, says it's obviously complicated and complex, and we haven't figured out how to test impairment from what we've been talking. But do you think that we legalized it too quickly? Are we not ready for it to be in the hands of the public?
I mean, I would say it was already in the hands of the public.
Yeah.
It's not like it just magically showed up. It has been here. It just hasn't been talked about. But cannabis consumption is older than I am, for sure.
And if it could substitute for other potential legal substances that are more widely acceptable in society, I'm thinking alcohol, cannabis is safer long-term.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. I talk to my kids all the time, like I don't want them doing any drugs until they're 25 because their brain is still developing. But if they so feel they have to, please don't drink liquor. Please don't use tobacco. These are the ones that please don't eat refined sugar. Right? These are the ones that I am more concerned about than cannabis. And I think that legalization helps us have these conversations versus when it's illegal, nobody wants to talk about it. And education is always the best form of helping people make responsible choices.
This has been some really great, factual, solid information that would be very useful around the community. The next month program is, as Forrest mentioned, on the Supreme Court, how it's functioning now and how it might function in the future, and what's eroding confidence on the part of some people in the decisions that are made. So look for that. And thank you again, Danielle and Josh. It's really, really been a pleasure and a fantastic learning experience.
Thanks for having us. It's really great to be introduced and that we're talking about this on a professional level, not just in the cannabis circles.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'm just grateful that this community accepts this type of work too, and this type of research. I think it speaks really highly of our community and of Bellingham as a whole. So thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody. See you next time.